In Seneca, Illinois, the Rooney family lived on a farm in 1885. They were an elderly couple originally hailing from Ireland, consisting of Patrick Rooney and Matilda, along with their farmhand, John Larson. It was as lax as ever on December 24th. It was Christmas Eve, and the daily work had been done. In the 8 o'clock hour, John Larson sat down with the Rooneys and socialized over glasses of whiskey, and everything seemed to be fine. Everyone was sober and didn't overindulge. Around 9 o'clock, John left the house and headed home, truly just like any day. But what John didn't realize was that this was the last time he or anyone would see the old couple alive. What happens next is a complete unknown. All we know is that sometime between 9 o'clock and midnight, a fire broke out at the Rooney house. Although it was the mysterious circumstances that continued to make people scratch their heads. When midnight rolled around, neighbors noticed smoke billowing out of the residence and took it upon themselves to break through the door in hopes of saving the couple. Unfortunately, they would be met with a dire sight. Almost instantly. Right there on the floor lay the lifeless body of Patrick Rooney. Patrick's corpse was undamaged, most likely succumbing to smoke inhalation before he could exit the house. As for the main concentration of the fire, its source, that answer was deeper into the house. The neighbors would indeed find Matilda, but not very much of her. The fate of Patrick being so far from the actual fire was troubling enough, so the thought of Matilda's safety didn't inspire much confidence. Right there, next to the stove, a pile of char and ash that used to be Matilda Rooney sat on the floor where the blaze once burned. In those macabre remains, all that was left of Matilda were her stockings, feet, spine, bits of skull with her hairpins melted in, and torso. Just below all that was even more bizarre. Pooled on the wooden floor was a small puddle of body fat. In the end, whatever caused the fire was long burned out by the time the couple was found. Strangely, despite such a devastating scene, the damage to the house was oddly minimal. There was no smoke damage to any furniture. The largest indicators of the fire were soot stains on Patrick's body and the kitchen ceiling brown from the grease smoke. It couldn't have been the stove either, as it showed no signs of recent use. It's as if the fire began and ended with Matilda until she was literally cremated on the spot. Patrick, unfortunately, losing his life in the process too. The flames only affected Matilda and a 1-foot radius around her, nothing more. In terms of investigation, there was very little to go by. There had obviously been a fire, but every form of accelerant was ruled out. No lamp oil, no alcohol, no fuel whatsoever. And even if present, none could explain how Matilda was reduced to a pile of ash so quickly. For such an intense fire, it should have engulfed the house, but it didn't. Lastly, how did Matilda's feet, still in stockings, survive? The only potential witness was John Larson, the farmhand. He was questioned on December 26th and described a relaxing Christmas Eve, sharing whiskey with the couple before leaving. He insisted they hadn't overdone the alcohol and everything seemed fine. Yet, John vanished from his lodgings on New Year's Day without a trace. Neighbors claimed they saw him leave at night with nothing but a satchel. This cast suspicion on him. Had he committed arson, fled out of guilt? Newspapers even accused him of being responsible for barn fires in Indiana. True or not, John had disappeared. Officially, Matilda's death was attributed to the wick effect, where a person's body fat acts as fuel. This was supported by her melted fat and the fire's localized nature. But what sparked it? Some theorized a stray ember ignited her flannel dress. Others, however, suspected Patrick. In 1935, over 50 years later, Walter T. Harrington made a deathbed confession. His grandfather, Seamus Harrington, a neighbor, allegedly saw Patrick light Matilda's dress on fire while she slept after an argument. Seamus claimed he fled upon hearing screams and never told authorities. However, Walter had an obsession with the case, and the couple wasn't known to argue. Within days, the Rooney home was looted for souvenirs. Floorboards stained with Matilda's remains, nails, wall fragments, and even vials of fireplace soot were sold as her ashes. Her intact stockings were displayed at a LaSalle County store for months. The house and the Rooney's memory were exploited by greed and disrespect, yet legends persisted. Matilda's ghost was said to haunt the kitchen, depicted as the Fire Witch in Penny Dreadfuls. Harvard studied wall samples, occultists held seances, and locals claimed her burning blue ghost appeared at midnight. On Christmas Eve, 1889, 4 years later exactly, the abandoned Rooney house mysteriously burned down. The Seneca Gazette blamed a cigarette, but others believed Matilda's spirit ended the horror. The land became a potato farm, but the mystery never faded. In 2005, a historical marker was placed there, only to be stolen. To this day, no one knows what truly happened to the Rooneys on December 24, 1885. It remains one of history's most infamous cases of spontaneous human combustion. Where other cases present more logical explanations on the subject, this one almost struggles to find even the slightest one. Jeannie Saffin was a 61-year-old woman living in Edmonton, North London. In 1982, Jeannie suffered from congenital mental disabilities that caused her to mentally function similarly to that of a child, so she lived under the care of her elderly father, Jack Saffin, and brother-in-law, Donald Carroll. On September 15, 1982, all three members were in the kitchen. Jeannie sat nearby on a chair. As Jack recounts, out of the corner, a surge of bright light suddenly swelled within the room. Looking back, he was met with the horrific sight of his daughter suddenly engulfed in flames. And as if the initial sight wasn't horrifying enough, Jeannie didn't seem to react as one would if smothered by flames. In fact, her demeanor was unusually calm, not out of some kind of intense form of shock, but as if it weren't causing any pain at all. She didn't stand, only continuing to remain in the chair, hands in lap. Jack and Donald used the convenience of the kitchen sink to douse her in water, which resulted in both their hands getting burned in the process. Even though her disposition was relatively neutral throughout the ordeal, brother-in-law Donald Carroll would later provide a detail that stunned everyone he told. As the flames raged on, he said that Jeannie had fire emanating from her mouth of all places, the fire glowing blue in color, literally shooting outward from the depths of her stomach. Donald said, quote, "She was roaring like a dragon." When the fire was extinguished, Donald and Jack were left with a graphic yet puzzling scene. Jeannie hadn't outwardly shown signs of distress from this, but the results from the fire left more than 90% of her body ravaged by third-degree burns. Even stranger, the cardigan she was wearing burned to a crisp, but neither the kitchen nor the chair she was sitting on was damaged. Jeannie was rushed to the Old Church Hospital in Romford, where doctors documented even more bizarre details. For one, though most of her body had been damaged, her feet and legs were spared from the fire. When Donald told the doctors about the fire shooting from her mouth, they heavily doubted the claim because, surprisingly, there were no signs of burning in her mouth. Despite this being true, Donald remained committed to what he saw. Perhaps the most bizarre result from the medical examination was the fact that none of her internal organs were burned. It's important to note that victims of external fires of this magnitude do in fact suffer internal burns, but this suggests Jeannie's case was something different. Sadly, after 8 days of intensive care, Jeannie Saffin died from bronchopneumonia. Police would search the home where it happened in hopes of finding anything at all to explain how this could have happened. But there was simply nothing to indicate potential for fire hazard, especially not one to specifically affect Jeannie. Nothing electrical was at fault, no gas leaks were found either. The only factor that could have partially be ruled in was Jack Saffin's pipe. He happened to be smoking it just before Jeannie caught fire, and it was speculated perhaps the embers from that fell as he refilled it, causing the spark. This is highly doubtful though. Having done everything they could to find a source for the mysterious blaze, the final verdict was deemed unexplained. When the possibility of spontaneous combustion was presented, the coroner refused to accept that as one of the valid causes, but did acknowledge that Jeannie's death was indeed unexplainable. A sad and confusing end to the 61-year-old Saffin, but certainly one that leaves more questions than answers. What started the fire? And if it came from within her body, how? Why is it that when Jack and Donald tried to put it out, they burned themselves, yet not even Jeannie's chair was damaged? On that note, that leaves us with probably the biggest question of them all. Why did Jeannie Saffin react with zero pain from burning, yet her body still suffered from its effects? The following is likely one of the most, if not the most, infamous story attributed to spontaneous combustion. Going back to 1951, we follow a woman living in St. Petersburg, Florida, named Mary Hardy Reeser. She was an old widow of 67, originally hailing from Columbia, Pennsylvania in 1884. She married physician Richard Reeser Sr. up until his death in 1947, where she decided to make the move to St. Petersburg to be closer to her son, Richard Reeser Jr., his family, and grandchildren. Now in Florida, Mary moved into an apartment at 1200 Cherry Street Northeast and led a very modest, quiet life. A devout Lutheran, Reeser attended church, made new friends, and generally did her best to adjust to life coming from such a different environment. Unfortunately, this was something she never got used to. Although she enjoyed being so close to her son and in-laws, Mary just couldn't stand the heat that came with daily Florida living, and gradually missed some of her friends back up north. In fact, the last time she was seen alive was shortly after a trip she'd planned back to Pennsylvania was unfortunately canceled. On July 1st, 1951, Mary was visited by her son and daughter-in-law at the apartment. She had told them that she'd taken 2 sleeping pills and planned to go to bed for the night once she'd taken 2 more. Around 8:30 p.m., her son kissed her goodbye and left her alone. This was the final time Mary Reeser was seen alive. From what we know of her movements thereafter, Mary got changed into a rayon acetate nightgown, black slippers, sat down in her overstuffed upholstered chair, and lit up a cigarette. On July 2nd, Mary Reeser's landlady, Pansy Carpenter, approached Mary's door to deliver a telegram, but she quickly felt that something was terribly wrong. Mary's doorknob was hot to the touch. Pansy immediately called the fire department, certain that Mary's room was on fire. She wasn't answering and the situation looked dire. When firefighters arrived, they forced their way into Mary's apartment, and what they found was nothing short of horrifying. The scene of the event was jarring, putting it mildly. Amid a sea of soot were the partial remains of the 67-year-old Mary, still laying on what was left of her melted chair. We use the term remains lightly, as Miss Reeser was reduced to quite literally a pile of ashes, springs from her upholstered chair protruding upward. In fact, the only parts of her that remained whole were a piece of backbone and her left foot, still wearing the slippers she'd changed into the night before. Mary Reeser quite literally disintegrated. As investigators examined the apartment, an unexplainable series of details made themselves known throughout the apartment. For it was obvious that a fire had ravaged Mary's body, but the flames, more or less, seemed to stop there. Much of the immediate area was touched not by flame, but by its byproducts. The ceiling retained smoke damage, the nearby window screen to the dining room caked in soot, and the drapes had been coated as well. Besides Mary's chair, the only other things that had been burned were her end table and the partition separating the kitchen and living room. Meaning, for the most part, the fire stayed focused on Mary, hardly spreading at all. If only that were the main question, though. What really baffled the public was the question of what in the world started the blaze in the first place. The most prominent theory was that Reeser fell asleep in the chair with her cigarette in hand. Richard Jr. made it clear to police that she told him about the sleeping pills, so maybe Mary accidentally caught fire while sleeping. But it still didn't make any sense. There just weren't enough pieces to form a full picture. On top of missing details, investigators found literally no accelerant in her room to create a fire of this magnitude. On top of this, no neighbors, not even landlord Pansy Carpenter, reported any signs or smells from that apartment to indicate anything happening, not even smoke. Possibly the craziest clue. Supposedly, Mary's skull was also recovered from the scene, but strangely, it had been shrunk to the size of a small teacup. Many refute this claim as a mere rumor, but even then, the Tampa Bay Times reported that her skull should have exploded under the intense heat, rather than shrink. This is all mostly an urban legend. The police chief of St. Petersburg sought more answers and sent Mary's teeth and other bone fragments directly to the FBI, who analyzed the evidence and ultimately came to the conclusion that this was a phenomenon known as the wick effect. As mentioned in the Rooney story, the results are as follows. Mary Reeser, asleep with cigarette alight, accidentally set herself on fire during her slumber. Why exactly did it burn so specifically? Well, her own body fat acted as fuel, hence why the flames stuck with her and only her, hardly touching anything else inside. Another detail corroborating this? Mary's fat was found melted into the carpet at the chilling scene as well, an effect mimicking a candle's burning wax, thus the name. Her apartment's flooring was concrete to boot, so this helped bolster the theory why the blaze didn't spread across the building. Officially, this is the reason, but many don't buy it. In a single evening, how did this woman get cremated to such a degree that hardly anything was left of her? The FBI believe that she burned between 3 and 5 hours, but for the human body to break down like Mary's, it would have had to burn between 8 and 12 hours instead, and at a heat between 1500 and 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, why did the apartment sustain such little damage? Beyond spontaneous combustion, others have even brought up the possibility of rogue lightning strikes or paranormal activity. It's a complete anomaly, and considered to be one of the US's first official investigations into spontaneous human combustion. According to the Tampa Bay Times, the family of Mary Reeser told the news that they could still feel her presence in the apartment, quote, up until they got rid of the furniture. A breeze blew during the interview, leading to one of the family members to say, quote, "That's Grandma again. Don't worry, she's nice."